You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast. I'm Mike Klein, and along with Brian Wood, today we are in Northeast Ohio at Galenas Cannabis, and we have the Director of Cultivation, Christine DeJesus, joining us. We just took a tour of the facility, and it is a beautiful facility. It is the only soil-grown organic cannabis grow in the state of Ohio. So Christine, thank you so much for joining us, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be on your amazing podcast. So my background is in agriculture, in the sense that I was a grower of produce, basically, before I was growing cannabis. So I grew at a very small farm in Bath, Ohio called Pint Size Farm, which was only a little over half an acre. And I spent 13 years growing a variety of different fruits and vegetables for Great Lakes Brewing Company. So it was kind of like the idea of the owner of Great Lakes to establish a small farm where we could grow seasonable food for the brew pub. And then we also grew small batch hops, and I grew all the pumpkins for the pumpkin ale every year. So it was a really great place to learn how to grow a very polyculture style of organic agriculture. So I grew about 30 different vegetable crops. I guess my cash crop would be heirloom tomatoes, so I did about 400 heirloom tomato plants a year, and I provided exclusively to the brewery. So it was a really wonderful arrangement because they basically funded me, and then everything went directly back to the brewery, so there was no farmers markets, there was no selling to multiple restaurants or anything like that. So it really gave me the opportunity to perfect my skills in a small scale organic farm setting. And after practicing organic agriculture just at home in a home garden scenario, it was exciting to have the opportunity to scale that up and then to try and implement some more commercial agriculture production methods. And then I very quickly became interested in regenerative agriculture and the concept of building soil and building soil health and biodiversity. And that then basically guided my experience into the cannabis world. So regarding cannabis, I started off more of an activist. I came to it not so much like many people come to medical cannabis from a patient perspective or from the perspective of knowing someone who medical cannabis helped substantially. And so that's where their interest in getting into cannabis came from. It wasn't so much like that with me. I didn't have a medical need. I didn't have a family member that had a medical need. I was more always interested in cannabis legalization from a social justice perspective. So to me, I grew up kind of a hippie. I went on Grateful Dead tour in my early 20s, and I got to know a lot of underground cannabis growers, and I saw them persecuted for growing plants, and some of them going to jail or even to prison. I started corresponding with prisoners of the drug war. So in my 20s, I was writing letters to people across the country that were in prison for drug possession. And I got to kind of hear these stories. For example, one person that I communicated with got a 26-year sentence for first-time possession of LSD when he was 18. He's probably still in prison. I've lost communication with him, but shout out to Joseph Rufra if you're still out there in Lumberton. But it really bothered me that there was 18, 19, 20-year-old kids basically going to prison for the rest of their life for possession of drugs. And that was something that I then became involved in, and activism was legalization of cannabis just from this social justice perspective. Because as we know, African Americans are discriminated much more heavily for drug possession, especially low-level drug possessions, and it deters a lot of things that can happen in a person's life and causes a lot of collaborative community problems. And so I started to become interested in cannabis legalization in 2013 was my first actual activism role, and I worked for the Ohio Rights Group to legalize medical cannabis. That initiative didn't get enough traction to make it on the ballot. I then got into a more professional role with Marijuana Policy Project in 2015 and 2016, and then continued my activism through the formation of Ohio's medical marijuana bill in 2016. So my backgrounds kind of then both collided, and once medical marijuana became legal in Ohio, I had this agricultural background. I also had this interest in social justice and in cannabis legalization. And when medical cannabis became legal, I definitely became interested in getting into a cultivation role in a legal cannabis facility. I had never grown cannabis outside of the legal framework, so I didn't have that like home grower background that a lot of people do when they come into the industry. I had this agriculture background, and so I wasn't sure if it was going to, be the right fit. But as I got into this cannabis grow here with Galenas, I was really grateful that I had that agriculture background, because producing cannabis on a large scale like this really has a lot more to do with commercial agriculture than it does with like a closet grow. So I was able to bring a lot of the practices in regenerative ag that I had already been honing in on and perfecting, I guess, and transition that into a cannabis cultivation job, and it's been really exciting. So I had no interest in working in a facility that was not organic, so we'll put that right there. I was working at the Cleveland School of Cannabis, which is actually the only cannabis school east of the Mississippi. I wrote some of their horticulture curriculum from an organic perspective, and I didn't apply to any other cannabis cultivation facilities in the state until I knew that one was committed to organic cannabis production. And then as soon as I found out that Galenas was going to be a organic cannabis facility, that's when my resume hit them here at the facility, and I moved into the role of director in last August, and it's just been an amazing opportunity since then. So,
and Galenas, their whole plan from the beginning was to grow in soil organically?
Correct. Yep. So growing in living soil presents a lot more challenges, obviously, than growing hydroponically. There's a lot more inputs. There's a lot more complexity to it. There's a lot more costs to it. But the owner and CEO believed that it produced a superior product, which I also believe. And there's also much more of a commitment to sustainability involved in organic cannabis production than in most hydroponic and soilless operations. So hydroponic operations use a tremendous amount of water. They use a lot of chemical nutrients, chemical pesticides. It's a very artificial environment. And so not only are they contributing a lot of chemicals and into the waste stream and using a lot of unsustainable resources, but the product itself may carry a lot of those chemical residues and pesticides into the final product. And so in the state of Ohio, there's quite a big list of legal pesticides, and we were committed to not using any of those pesticides, any of those chemical nutrients, but rather just producing a completely natural and very clean product here at Galenas.
So two things would be, is hydroponic the commonly way of growing cannabis? And then the second thing is organic technically is not allowed for cannabis because it's not federally accepted. So you're not actually certified organic, quote unquote, through the USDA, correct?
Exactly. Yes. So to answer your first question, yes, hydroponic is probably the more mainstream production method in cannabis agriculture due to the simplicity of it. It's very machine oriented. You're basically, like, to me, it's almost like you're taking a plant and you're putting it in a little square of inert material, and you're just kind of affixing little IVs to it, basically. So it's kind of like, instead of, like, I kind of look at it like either you can eat like a whole foods diet, or you could just take intravenously all the things you need to live. So that's kind of like what's happening to the plant. It's just basically being fed like a cocktail of chemicals to keep it alive and to make it produce a product in a hydroponic grow, generally. But in a living soil perspective, it's almost like more like that whole foods diet. So the plant gets to kind of more select what nutrients it's going to take out of the soil, and it's in a much more natural process. So it seems to prove in testing that there's a lot of a more full spectrum product that can come out of a living soil grow. So that would answer your first question. And then the second thing is, yes, and I really technically can't even use the word organic when I talk about cannabis cultivation or our product, because organic is, kind of like owned by the USDA, and because the term organic, comes with obviously having to qualify for the organic certification in commercial produce agriculture. Because cannabis is still not federally legal, there is no organic certification that you can get for cannabis. So what we do to prove to our consumer that we're following all those rules is we have a third-party certifier, and that's called Certified Kind. And so Certified Kind basically takes those organic standards and practices and applies them to cannabis, and we have to qualify for that certification by meeting all of those requirements. So any input we use, any organic fertilizer, our soil, even cleaning products, they all have to be on the list of organic approved materials. So basically, like if they're OMRI certified, generally they're approved. And then each year we have to get audited. And so when we get audited, the Certified Kind will go back through our records and look at all of the purchases we've made. They'll look at our metric entries, which are our ways of tracking all the data for like when a plant receives fertilizer or any other input. And they'll make sure that we're following by the book all of the rules set out by the Certified Kind program. And then they also do pesticide testing of leaves. So they can actually request leaf material and have that tested for pesticide residues to make sure that you're not breaking any of the rules. So all of our product is scrutinized very heavily by the state for like illegal pesticides, but Certified Kind will take that one step farther and make sure that you're not using any non-organic inputs on the material.
Now I see I'm from Michigan. Mm-hmm. Michigan has recreational marijuana legalized, and I see a lot of marketing that says pesticide free. And I assume this is probably in a hydroponic grow operation. Are they actually not using pesticides, or is there just no residue?
Yeah, so that's been a pretty slippery slope for sure in cannabis, because a lot of people are just using labels and terms pretty freely and saying, oh, this is pesticide free, or this is naturally grown, or this is organic. A lot of people are using the term organic, but because there's no one overseeing to make sure that anybody's following that rule or those rules, there's really no way to tell what people are doing. So I mean, unless first of all, you just have to know your farmer and trust your farmer, just like with food. So if you're able to go to the facilities, talk to the people there, find out what materials they're using, that's one way to educate yourself. But there's still a lot of practices where people could be saying one thing but doing something differently. You can obviously look at pesticide testing results and see, what products people are using. But it's been a problem more so for cannabis than for other industries because of the lack of regulation, so the lack of federal regulation. So another argument for federal legalization would be to protect the consumer from those types of kind of exploitations of terms like that.
So Certified Kind, that's the same thing as the USDA seal for food, but the USDA allowed hydroponics now in organics. Does Certified Kind allow hydroponic grow?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure. So that I know that's always been kind of like an area of contention between organic growers. Like, should hydroponic production be certified organic? I know there was like a big debate over that, and the ruling was challenged, and there's people that have spoken out very loudly against allowing hydroponics to be certified organic. So I'm not 100% sure what certified kinds policy is regarding hydroponics. I would imagine if it is certifiable by the USDA, then it would be also certifiable by certified kind. Okay. So, but the trick with, of course, with organic hydroponics is, how do you supply the nutrients, in what form, in what system. I think there's been a lot of advancements now over making water-soluble organic nutrients. I know aquaponics is a really interesting bridge in that situation by using, incorporating fish into a closed-loop system and using a very natural form of, like, the fish waste, obviously, to fertilize the plants. And there's some very successful aquaponic growers of cannabis now. So that's really an exciting frontier. That's something that I'm very interested in. But soil still has a value or a premium, in my opinion, over hydroponic grows, not just because of the fact that you can input these organic materials in that way, but also just because of the plant's relationship with soil and how it uses nutrients from soil is different, essentially, than how it does with hydroponics. So to me, like, the most natural form of plant growth is probably going to provide the healthiest end result, in my opinion. So to me, soil is like a key component of the system because there's probably immeasurable things, cannabinoids, in cannabis that maybe we haven't even discovered the value of, that may be missing in a hydroponic grow operation. But also with soil-grown cannabis, I feel like it's doing more than just providing this superior product. It's also part of a sustainability loop. So when you're hydroponically growing, you're using enormous amounts of water. That water is most likely not being recycled in any way or used again, so it's running to a drain and it's being wasted. And in a living soil grow, you have this, like, valuable material that can still have another use. So what's kind of really exciting about what we're doing with our soil is we're getting our soil from our soil maker, which we'll should talk more about because they're amazing. And then when our cannabis is done being grown in the soil, we're taking that soil and we're donating it to Let's Grow Akron, which is an amazing community garden network in the Akron area that I want to say they run like over 100 different community gardens and farms in Akron. And that spent soil then is going in to build their raised beds, and then they're growing food out of it. So that food then can be composted. That compost can then be turned back into soil. That soil can again grow cannabis, and it can grow food, and it can become part of this perpetual loop of reusing materials versus just sending a bunch of water down the drain that may be potentially contaminated with phosphorus or something else and can contribute to more problems like algae blooms in lakes and just lack of lower water quality. So I think there's more, and that's just kind of one aspect of the benefits of soil grown products, in my opinion, are the ability to reuse the soil, but also by using soil, like you're sequestering carbon and you're building biodiversity and you're doing a lot of other things for the planet by growing in soil and being more sustainable about your growing model.
Well, and it's similar to the hydroponic argument that has been used for why it shouldn't be certified organic, which is, there, and Mike and I have talked with some soil biologists that we're at the tip of the iceberg of what we know is in living soil, and we have no idea what the plant all is taking up. We get the basic concept, but we still don't understand everything. So I'm sure it's the same thing here. And that loop you talked about is, it's Nathan Rutz with Rust Belt Riders, who we've had on the podcast before. Can you just start there with your process of how that, I mean, you kind of flowed through the loop of soil to garden and then come back around through Rust Belt Riders. But can you walk through your process?
Sure,
too?
absolutely. So I've been kind of thinking about it under the framework of kind of like this working title in my mind that I've been calling like food, medicine, food. Okay, so food waste we know is a huge problem. It contributes to like 40% of all the waste in landfills. It's a completely reusable waste product that is thrown out all over the place from restaurants and just from homes and consumers. And so the Rust Belt Riders were this group of guys that, as you mentioned, you've had on your podcast, amazing group of people that have been very thoughtful in the way they've grown their business. And they started off in the Cleveland area gathering food waste excuse me, on bicycles with carts. And I saw them in action doing that maybe 6 or 8 years ago when I was working for Great Lakes Brewing Company, because they were picking up materials from the Ohio City area. So I'd seen them on the bicycles. They came into the brewery. They picked up materials from the brewery. And so they're a small scale composter that's like doing the hard work of finding the resources that really need some place to go and building the infrastructure to be able to use that compost or to turn that material into compost. Then they started making soil a few years ago. And Nathan, I think he's just a real interesting person that's really dived really deeply into like soil microbiology. So I feel really excited about like using his soils now. So when I had met him and knew that he was making soil and I was here working at Galenas, I wanted to bring in some of that soil on a trial basis and see how it performed. So his soil, I want to say it's about 35% compost. So it's taking that food waste, turning into this really rich soil that is very carefully made. And we brought some of it in, we trialed it, it worked great for cannabis. So that was their sprout soil, which is just an amazing like vegetable and vegetative kind of growth soil for us. So we bring that sprout soil in. As I mentioned, we trialed it on a small scale. It worked out really well. We scaled it up substantially last run, and now we're growing exclusively in it this harvest run. So the sprout soil we use as our vegetative growth medium. It's pretty rich as far as soils go. It's got the right density for us, and the cannabis just seems to just flourish in it. Then after we started using that in the vegetative growth cycle, we talked more with the Rust Belt Riders about creating a custom flower soil for us. So cannabis goes through two distinct phases of growth. It goes through its, as do all plants, but we kind of separate them and isolate them a little more in cannabis agriculture. So it goes through its vegetative growth cycle, which can be anywhere from a few days in some commercial grows up to a month in indoor grows. But in outdoor grows, it's substantially longer because cannabis is annual. So outdoors, it grows just one crop per season. But indoors, we kind of force, this artificial environment upon it, and we're able to grow 4 or more harvests per year. So we go through the vegetative phase, which here at our facility lasts about 3.5 weeks. We grow in the sprout soil during that 3.5 weeks. And then we transplant all of our small plants, which are now about 2 feet high or so, maybe a little taller, into this custom soil, which we have Rust Belt making for us now, which we're calling Bloom. And that soil is modified to have higher calcium and phosphorus amounts in it. And then it also is designed to fit into our system, which we run an autopot system, which is a sub-irrigation system. So the plants are being automatically watered in each pot from the bottom. So the soil medium has to be very light and porous, and also has to have the ability to like wick the water up properly. So after working with him, we decided to add like some more perlite and to remove sand and to do a couple other things that would help the soil wick up moisture correctly and also not compact over time. So we then transplant the plants from the sprout into the flower soil. and then the plants then flower in that soil exclusively for 8 to 9 weeks. And so that new flower soil we tried again in a more experimental form last production run. We ran about 900 plants in it, and we were really, really happy with it. We saw higher yields. The plants were just extremely healthy from start to finish. We previously had imported a soil from Colorado, an organic soil that was very popular on the West Coast, and now we didn't have to ship soil across the country. We have this local soil maker, so we could kind of keep this closed regenerative loop going in the Northeast Ohio area, and we're able to work directly with Nathan to like change things if we want to slightly adjust nutrients or slightly adjust porosity or some other feature of the soil. But then that, like, kind of the really special part of it is, you may be eating at a restaurant in Ohio City, and the food that your salad that you don't finish could end up going into a compost, which then comes to Rust Belt and is turned into a soil, which then comes to our facility and we grow medicine out of. And you may be a medical marijuana patient and you may go to a dispensary over here in Akron or in Cleveland and buy our product that was grown in your leftover food, basically. And then that remaining soil that we no longer need because we've already grown the cannabis out of still has a high level of nutrient. So cannabis is a very nutrient hungry plant. So it needs more nutrient than most vegetable crops need to grow. So the spent soil, what we have left over, which we can't reuse because of the risk of it carrying, some type of plant pathogen or something like that forward, or maybe some microbe like a root feeding nematode or some type of organism that we don't want to multiply out into another grow. And it's very different, obviously, in indoor production than outdoor. If we were in outdoor production, we just compost it back down and re-amend it and use it to grow more plants. But in indoor production, it's not quite so easy. So then we're able to take that spent soil, donate it to Let's Grow Akron. They can build their community gardens out of it. They can then grow more food, which may make its way back onto your plate, and then the whole cycle can continue. So it's really nice to know that we're building this really sustainable model for agriculture, produce and cannabis to kind of work together in this same agricultural loop. It's pretty cool.
Well, I was going to say, I was going to quibble with your spent soil word, but you clarified there because it's far from spent.
Exactly.
It's got a lot of life left in it.
It definitely has a lot of life left in it. It may even be enhanced in some ways because we're using compost teas, which are then again, maybe building biodiversity. And then we depend basically solely for our pest control on predator insects. So we have some really cool helpers here that are our insect friends that we introduce into our soil and into our plants, which may then carry into that soil. And when it goes to the garden, they already have these beneficial insect populations, which then can protect them again against outdoor pests. Mm-hmm. So we use multiple predator insects, one that lives generally on the plants. It's a predator mite. And then we use predator mites in the soil as well that will hunt down larvae of fungus gnats, for example, or a general problem that soil growers have just because of the fact that you're using soil. They kind of look like fruit flies, basically. So when that soil is spent, quote unquote, then it also has a lot of these predators in it that may then provide a further level of protection for the home gardener or for the community gardener. So on the protection that you're using, it is cannabis. It seems as we were walking through it definitely, and I've heard this before, that they're highly susceptible to mold, funguses, disease, insects, all these different things. Is that because of being grown indoor, or is that also partially because it's just a very nutrient hungry plant that needs to be
quote unquote babied along a little bit, or would being outdoors kind of change that?
So it's interesting for me because I came from outdoor agriculture and moved indoors. So it's been, a learning process for me to kind of like navigate the indoor agriculture setting. So I think to answer your question, the majority of the risk comes from the setting. So like in outdoor agriculture, you're always at the mercy of rain, of course, and humidity and dew points and changing humidity. So, I think we know that it's not so much like, although obviously the higher humidity you have, the higher disease risk you have, but it's more like that swing of humidity that can really trigger like sporulation of things like powdery mildew. So like when you get into August in the field, generally you see powdery mildew setting in because you're getting these cooler nights and these warmer days, and you're getting this dew point, and you're getting these big swings in humidity that then can cause condensation on leaves. And then once you start getting heavier rains, or let's say a hurricane rain comes through and it rains for 3 or 4 days straight, then you see these outbreaks of powdery mildew. So some plants are obviously much more susceptible. So like, pumpkins and cucumbers and squash and certain flowers and certain vegetable plants will have a higher risk of those types of diseases. Cannabis, I wouldn't say it's like a really high risk plant, comparatively speaking. Like tomatoes, for example, like I was probably the plant that I had the hardest time with protecting from disease in the field because of like the blights. So like that late blight that always came in seemed inevitable that your plants were going to get that. And whether that's, just in the environment or it's just coming in from transplants or seed, or who knows exactly how it's getting there. But once it's there, the spores are in the field, and it's really difficult to grow another crop in the same area without, having the risk of that disease coming in at some point. So you generally, it was affecting like plants in later stage growth, not so much in the early stages. So cannabis, I personally haven't had any disease problems with cannabis at all, knock on wood. Luckily, in our indoor grow here, but we also have a really highly controllable environment. And I think where the problem comes in for a lot of other growers is that environment isn't able to be controlled so well. So a lot of other grows are like really low tech. Like for example, in California, there's just tons of indoor grows, and they may just like take like an old warehouse or maybe a greenhouse or a production facility that was growing another plant and try and retrofit it and turn it into a cannabis grow. So there may already be pathogens in that environment that then can carry over into the cannabis grow, or there generally are problems with like being able to remove humidity, for example, or control your temperature set points. So at Galenas, we've invested a lot on the front end and to be able to control the environment very carefully. So like I can set my humidity at exactly where I need it throughout the grow and adjust it accordingly so that I'm avoiding those high risk type areas like the swings when the temperature changes, for example, when the lights go on or when the lights go off. And then the other, I think, thing that's really contributed to our success has been the Sub-Irrigation System. So instead of watering the plants from the top, or dragging hoses around or buckets of water and having moist soil on the tops of all the pots, the soil stays very, very dry on the top layer. So the water is all being drawn up from the bottom, and having that nice dry soil surface, you don't see like spore growth and splashing up to the leaf surfaces like you do in outdoor agriculture when it rains. So it's been like exciting and fun for me to be able to work in this like crazy environment where I'm able to actually control the temperature and the sunrise and the sunset and the humidity, and I don't have to deal with rain and all those kind of things. But in more lower tech environments, it is really a battle trying to bring in fans and remove humidity and get proper ventilation. So we have really good air circulation here. We have fresh air intake coming into the grow at all times, and good filtering systems, and an environmental control system which just modulates everything and I'm able to check it from my cell phone, which I do several times a day, even in the middle of the night, lots of times, and make sure that everything's in the right, range, and that I don't have to worry about problems. But I think living soil contributes again to the success here, because having like this biodiversity of microorganisms in the soil, we know that there's bacteria, there's fungi, there's organisms in the soil that their job is basically to keep the plants safe from pathogens. So having all those good guys outnumbering the bad guys in the soil, I think provides a lot of disease suppression that maybe we would have already had problems with if we were in like a soilless medium, or if we were in a hydroponic situation. So again, I'm trying to, just like in outdoor regenerative agriculture, my focus is on soil health, and if my soil is healthy, then my plants are healthy. And so the same thing, I'm doing the same exact thing inside. I'm very concerned about my soil. I'm very picky, of course, and that's why I'm working with Rust Belt to get a really superior product that has great biodiversity. And I know Nathan takes that soil and looks at it under a microscope. He's given me biological counts of all the organisms in the soil before I've ordered it. And I know that he's providing me a really biodiverse, healthy soil to start. But then I'm very careful to make sure that I'm keeping my soil organisms healthy, making sure that there's the proper moisture levels in the soil, the proper temperatures, and I'm not using anything in the soil excuse me, that could be damaging to the microorganisms. So, like for example, there's other soil growers that may have a pest issue in the soil, like let's say fungus gnats, for example. So fungus gnats will, no matter what, they're going to get into your facility, they're going to lay their eggs in the soil, and these larvae are going to hatch and start eating your plant's roots. So other growers might pour some chemical or an oil or something like that, it could be organic, maybe not, into their soil to kill the fungus gnat larva, but then inevitably they're killing all of the good microorganisms in their soil, and then they'll have a disease outbreak because they don't have the right microorganisms protecting their plant's roots. So even if it's, and this is how I operated at Pine Size Farm for Great Lakes Brewing Company, I never use an input, even if it's certified organic, that is going to leave a residue in my soil or cause any sort of, kill any sort of organism in the soil. Because once you kill one organism, then it's just a chain reaction, then inevitably things get out of balance and you've lost that balance in the soil. So I don't apply anything to the soil other than pure water, occasionally like a light nutrient, like a soluble fish powder, or like a seaweed extract or something like that I'm applying to the soil to just boost the plant's immune system or add a little bit of fertility to the soil. But even in those situations, I monitor the concentration of the organic nutrient and make sure that it's in the right pH range, that it's very, very dilute, and that it's something that isn't going to throw off the balance of my soil. So like when you walk in the facility, there's a board, it has the pH, it has the nutrient level of the soil that's monitored every single day by our quality control director, and it's very, very stable. Like you can go back through the records and look, and the pH hasn't changed since the day the plants went into it. If I was adding a lot of nutrient, inevitably you'll get swings in your pH, you'll get swings in the concentration of nutrients in the soil, and then all of those things then are going to affect your soil microbes, and suddenly you won't have the right mix of organisms in the soil, and you'll probably have problems with disease. So by keeping the soil really healthy, I'm able to suppress disease naturally, like a healthy ecosystem would in the outdoors. So I don't think cannabis is specifically more susceptible to any sort of disease. To me, honestly, it's been easier than growing tomatoes. But again, I went from outdoor to indoor. So, is it always that way? Are there some strains or cultivars that are more challenging to grow? Definitely. There's some that don't like the environment that we have as much as others. And so our job is just to keep selecting plants that perform really well in that environment versus trying to force a plant to grow in an artificial environment that doesn't want to, so.
And I think as we were walking through, I think part of what led to that question of talking about diseases and insects and all these things that can happen within the cannabis plant, comparing it to tomatoes. If you get affected by something along those lines in a tomato crop, your yield is going to be affected, but not necessarily, you're still going to get some product that you can sell. Whereas here, as we were talking, you're also significantly concerned about what those molds and insects or whatever else can get in the plant could do to the end quality of the product, because you're so significantly tested on all those different, well, and you can go into some of that kind of stuff too.
Definitely. So that was a big, I don't want to say it was an adjustment because we haven't had problems failing tests at all, but it was definitely a scary thing when I started growing cannabis. It's like this gauntlet of tests that you have to pass. So cannabis is by far the most scrutinized agricultural product in the United States. And rightfully so for many reasons. Now, are the regulations a little, is it hyper-regulated? Yes, definitely. And are there ways that, it can cause, it's cost prohibitive for a lot of people to even grow cannabis? Definitely. But cannabis is tested for, I want to say there's like 10 or 11 different tests that our product has to go through before it can go onto the market. So it's sampled, it's taken back to a lab, and then it's tested for mold spores, yeast, aerobic bacteria, coliforms, gram-negative bacteria, heavy metals including arsenic, mercury, lead, and cadmium. There's a moisture content threshold. I'm probably missing something here, but there's this incredible battery of tests that it has to pass before it's able to be sold onto the market. So I don't know that any food is scrutinized to that level, any food agricultural product. I've even heard stories of people that say, for example, they want to make a gummy or a fruit leather that's infused with cannabis, and it failing testing, the end product failing testing, even though the cannabis passed the testing, then the end product fails because of the heavy metals in like the fruit puree that was used to make the fruit leather. And those are organic fruit purees too. So they're certified organic, yet then the food product is failing for heavy metals when their input was a certified organic ingredient. So they have to, third-party test their organic ingredients that are food ingredients so they don't taint their cannabis products, basically, which is interesting. But with cannabis being so heavily scrutinized, you have to be really, really careful of what inputs you're using. So organic fertilizers tend to have large amounts of heavy metals. Part of the reason is because they come from rock dusts, like rock phosphate or azomite or other rock minerals just naturally have heavy metal, minerals as part of their natural makeup, but also probably because of the way commercial agriculture has used so many toxic chemicals in the field, like conventional agriculture, has then contributed to heavy metal buildups in the soil or pesticide residues in the soil. So like I haven't researched this myself, but a scientist was telling me that like cotton production, for example, used a lot of pesticides that contained arsenic, and that the arsenic then contaminated a lot of the soils where cotton was grown. Okay, so I'm sure that's kind of symptomatic of conventional agriculture as a whole, that you get these pesticide residues, you get heavy metals from different inputs that then contaminate soils, and then those residues carry through into the soils or fertilizer materials that then go back into agriculture. Plus, like one thing that I don't use is, and a lot of growers use in indoor settings, is like chicken manure products or bat guano products. So bat guano is a really common fertilizer that's used to grow cannabis and, of course, lots of food, and can be a really great application, particularly in outdoor settings. But in indoor settings, like personally, I feel like it's too high risk, because if you're using guanos or you're using chicken manures indoors, you don't have the sun and the wind and the beneficial microbes that may break those things down outdoors and kind of like render them safe. But in indoor settings, you can get contamination really easily from using guanos or animal manures. So like our soil does not contain any animal manures, and I specifically don't use guanos or manures indoors, because you may then fail for like salmonella or some other bacteria, some E. coli or some other coliform. And you have to be really protective of the product. So as it's growing, it can very easily become contaminated. Say you were applying a tea with a guano in it and it dripped on some of the flowers. We're a vertical grow here, so we have a tier above, a lower tier. So if you were applying a fertilizer on a top tier, it could drip down onto the lower tier, potentially contaminate a flower. That could then fail testing, or even worse, that could make somebody sick if it didn't fail testing. So if it somehow made it through. So I don't use any materials that test in any way high for like E. coli or salmonella. I just keep them entirely out of the facility. I mean, they can be great agricultural amendments, but in an indoor setting, the risk outweighs the benefit, in my opinion. But also, a lot of those products then contain heavy metals. So like guanos, for example, bats may eat insects which are contaminated with heavy metals from pesticides or something else, and then the bats accumulate the arsenic, and it's just this contaminated food chain which then multiplies out as a higher and higher consumer consumes it. So I'm really selective as to what inputs I use. They have to be really, really clean to start with. And then I also have any material that I will put into production third-party heavy metal tested. So like the soil I use, for example, from Rust Belt Riders, I have that heavy metal tested, because inevitably compost is going to carry some amount of heavy metals and or pesticides into the compost. Then I have that tested before I put it into use here and make sure that it's trace or non-detectable amounts of heavy metals and pesticides. Like another product that I don't use is neem oil, for example. So a lot of people use neem oil. I used it in the field in different settings when I first started farming, and then something about it didn't quite seem right to me. I didn't like broad spectrum insecticides anyways when I was in the field, because I felt it was dangerous to apply something that maybe a residue would linger on the crop, and a pollinator or an ant or some other organism may be killed by it that I don't, that I want around, basically. So like I was like really selective with the pesticides that I use in outdoor agriculture. Like I didn't use pyrethins, I didn't use neem oil. And when I started growing indoors, a lot of cannabis growers use neem oil. Well, neem has come back and been banned in several states for having other pesticide residues attached to the neem oil. So it hasn't been taken off shelves because it has an illegal pesticide naturally, but maybe like added to it. But maybe when they were growing the neem, someone was using a pesticide which is banned in the United States to grow the neem, and then when the neem is concentrated down, that banned pesticide would carry over, and then the person's cannabis would fail for a banned pesticide that they were never even using. So then people would be puzzled, like, how did this fail for this pesticide that I can't even pronounce when I never used it? And they traced it to the neem oil. So you have to be really careful about products you use containing residues of other products. So like another product that people use a lot that I don't use is like concentrated like rosemary oil or concentrated thyme oil. There's a lot of these like herbal oil products at like cannabis hydro stores or available commercially. And to me, well, there's multiple reasons I don't use those concentrated oils, but one is that, again, those plants were grown, who knows what they were necessarily treated with prior to being condensed into this oil or concentrated into this oil. So maybe someone sprayed something on the rosemary, then that pesticide could carry through into the oil. But the main reason I don't use those is because, again, they're like a broad spectrum kind of insecticide. So if you're using something that's killing insects, then you're also killing the good insects that we're importing, like the beneficial mites and things like that. But then though that oil may persist in the soil and kill microbes in the soil, or that oil again may make it to the dispensary, and even though it's a legal pesticide, there's not really much testing that shows, well, what happens if you vape rosemary oil, for example? Could it be carcinogenic? I don't know. Has there been really testing on every single input and what chemical composition it has once it's combusted? Not so much. So like, while an oil may be food safe to eat or considered technically food safe, has it really been tested in a vaped form? So when you combust things, obviously the chemical composition changes, and that could have a negative effect on a consumer. So at Galenas, we're eliminating all of those possibilities by just not using any of those products. So we're just trying to again, maintain this really healthy soil, keep the plants' immune systems really strong and healthy so that they can naturally fend against pests. And then we introduce this really large population of predator insects. So by introducing predator insects, my insect supplier, my main insect supplier is Copert. Copert's from, they're Dutch. And so they have a distributor here in Holland, Michigan, that we get our insects from. And my rep from Copert comes out, Chris, and we've talked about how it's kind of like the equivalent of having a lot of lions and having very few antelope, versus how nature works. There's a lot of antelope and there's very few lions. So you kind of like reverse that like apex predator model. So you introduce a lot of apex predators, and then if you do get a pest, which not that an antelope's a pest, but if you do get another lower level organism, then your apex predator eliminates those before they even can build a population. So there's not this like natural balance like there is in the wild, where you want to have just enough lions to be able to cull the herd or whatever. In this case, you don't want ever the herd to be established. So like the mite we use, I kind of refer to them as like the T-Rex of predator mites. It's a top level feeder, and so it'll feed on basically any other problem that could come into the grow, which like this is the time of year when spider mites, for example, are living on lots of plants all around us outside, and if they're carried into our grow, then they could quickly cause an outbreak because the conditions are just perfect for them. They like it hot, they like it dry. Well, in our flower rooms right now, it's nice and hot and it's nice and dry. So we put a sachet on every plant that has this little ecosystem of predator insects inside of it that has a slow release. They come out over like a bell curve over like 4 or 5, maybe 8 weeks, depending on your humidity and temperature. And then there's all of these little predator insects that are running around just waiting for a little pest to come in. They'll consume that before it ever leads to an outbreak. Same thing with pest eggs or something like that too. Something lays eggs, they'll consume the eggs, then you avoid the outbreak. So it's more expensive on the front end to provide to do it this way versus just waiting for the problem and then spraying a chemical. Obviously that's a lot cheaper. But by doing it this way, we're able to avoid any problems. Yes, it's more expensive. Yes, we have to do things to keep our predators alive and healthy, so we can't spray pesticides or that'll kill our predators. We, have to keep the environment in the right parameters, not just for our plants, but for our predators too, which are generally pretty much the same. But it's always something that we have to think of. Like are we doing things that are managing our predator insects' health as well? But by doing that, then not only do we avoid pest problems, but we eliminate the need for any pesticides. And then when our product goes to the market, our predators have already all died, basically, because they've ran out of food sources. And we can provide a product to the market that's really clean, that doesn't have any residues of any kind on it. So it's a good feeling.
When you select plants, so when you first got started, did you start with, let's say, 10 varieties, or was it 100 varieties, and then you'll grow and then you'll select the best out of that group to keep as a mother? Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, so we started with a lot of varieties, and we're trying to always scale it down. So by starting with like a really large pool of genetics, then we're able to see what works best in our system, what produces the product that consumers like the most. There's so many different like aspects to what makes a good cannabis flower. So we only sell flower. Some grows have processing licenses also. We just have a cultivation license here. So we don't process anything into another product. We don't sell edibles or vape cartridges or anything like that. We only sell flower. So our flower has to be top notch, obviously, because it's a competitive area to be in, flower sales. And so we're looking at a plant and we're looking at multiple features of the finished product. So we want to make sure that it has the right terpene profile, which terpenes are like the kind of like the flavors, I guess you could say, of cannabis. Like, is it earthy? Is it fruity? Is it floral? Is it gassy? What smells? What tastes does it have in the vaped form? And then we're also looking for the THC, the CBD, CBG, CBN, other resins, basically, which are like the active ingredients that give cannabis its medicinal traits. And then we're looking at like the bud density, the bud size, how does it grind, how does it vape, how does it store, things like that. But then the other component of it is the plant itself. It's not just like the finished flower, but how does that plant work in our system? So if it's a plant that struggles or isn't very vigorous, then we don't want to grow it, obviously, because it's going to either have low yield or it's just going to be something that may be a disease risk because it's just not happy in our environment. We haven't really had any plants that we've had that kind of problem with. Most of them I've been able to like figure out what they want and kind of provide that. So like, for example, like one plant may like to be watered less frequently than another cultivar. So since we have a sub-irrigation system that we're generally turning it all on at once, we like the plants to all kind of drink at the same rate. Otherwise you're, trying to turn one on and not turn this one on, and it gets more complicated and takes more labor. So we're trying to kind of find plants that all have like a similar kind of like growth habit. Like they like similar nutrient regime, similar watering schedule, and then also have kind of like a similar height. So you want your canopy to be even throughout your room. So you don't want to grow a plant that'll naturally get 8 feet tall next to a plant that likes to only grow 3 foot, like a little like shrub, because then you're going to cause airflow problems because your air is not going to circulate right over the top of your canopy. And it's also just less standardized as far as workflow. So, when you're trellising, when you're training the plants into trellises, or when you're pruning the plants, you want it all to flow so all of your workers can just quickly move down a line and move through a room and not have to change what they're doing for different varieties. So there's a balance between having enough variety for the consumer and having the least amount of variety from like a commercial mass production sort of view. So we've tried to kind of find a balance with that. And right now we have 2 large rooms that we're growing about 750 plants in each room's flowering out. And so we'll grow maybe 8 varieties in each room. So almost 100 plants of each. And that'll give us enough variety that we can kind of still, give the customer different choices. So every cultivar of cannabis has a different effect medicinally, basically. So certain strains of cannabis may energize you, may give you energy to get through your morning or through a work day. That's really important for patients who have chronic pain and need something to help them manage their pain throughout their workday. Other forms of cannabis are really sedative. So for somebody that has insomnia, for example, like a cancer patient, like cancer patients in many cases cannot sleep. You know, they feel really edgy, and maybe from chemo, it may be from the other prescription drugs that they're on, and they really need something to help them sleep. So a sedative like indica dominant variety may work better for them at the end of the day, and maybe a more energizing, uplifting strain may work better for them through the workday or through their morning. So we don't want to just have like a one-size-fits-all, like we're only going to grow this type of cannabis that only has this medicinal effect, because there's so many, you know, I think there's like 20 or so qualifying conditions in Ohio to get your medical card. So what works for one person definitely doesn't work for another. Another important thing is like appetite stimulation, like particularly for like AIDS patients or somebody that is going through chemo. They really need something that can help stimulate their appetite, because in many cases people are like literally starving to death that are going through these types of treatments. So you may find a certain strain of cannabis that really stimulates appetite, and it may work for one person and it may not work for another patient too. So there's difference from patient to patient, but we try and keep like a really nice variety of cultivars out there so that we offer, you know, different forms of medicinal benefits for different patients. And then, you know, there's also the possibility of growing things that then we may sell to a processor. So maybe we want to grow something that has like a really fruity or floral terpene profile that by the time it's processed into another product, like an edible or like a vape cartridge, that profile carries through into the finished product. So it's driven a lot by the needs of patients. Of course, it's a medical program only in Ohio, so that's the primary goal, is to make sure that we're, you know, meeting all of the needs of the patients right now. And Ohio is still, you know, fairly early in the program. I mean, we've only had legal marijuana here for a few years, but I think that people are starting to embrace it more and more, especially as an alternative to opiates. Personally, I've known several people that have had opiate addictions that have used cannabis as like a step down. So they've been able to wean themselves off of opiates entirely through using cannabis to manage pain or to manage, you know, like PTSD, for example. There's a lot of really harsh drugs out there that manage PTSD that have horrible side effects that, you know, literally cause people to be like suicidal from being on the drugs. And so a lot of people that have PTSD have been able to use cannabis and have, you know, really, really good outcomes, eliminating those other more harsh drugs from this repertoire of management. And so it's important to find strains that'll help people in all those different scenarios. And once you kind of find those, then you get patient feedback. Like we'll get feedback, like we got some emails and messages from patients who were like, this was the first cultivar or strain, is kind of an interchangeable term, I guess, in cannabis, that I could actually sleep, or that actually managed my back pain to the point of where I could get through a work day without having to take a Vicodin or whatever. So then we get that information back. It's like, okay, this is working for people. We need to make sure that we are going to continually produce that so it's always available to them, because if it's available to them for only 3 months of the year, that's not really going to help them once they've found something that really works for them. So there's a lot of patient feedback that plays into it. And then, you know, you see the trends obviously in sales of what's working for different people. But we start with more cultivars, and then we find what works, what yields well, what produces the best quality medicine, and then we move those plants forward in production. So we've started with, I mean, we've probably already gone through, just as a guess, like at least maybe almost 100 different cultivars here. And now we're down to running like 8 cultivars a room. I imagine that may at some point get down to like 4 to 6 cultivars a room. But, would we ever just run one cultivar? Probably not. I mean, if it was something that was really beneficial for a lot of people and it made sense to do, yes. But it's such a new, like world of cannabis as medicine that really there's so many things out there that we don't even know what's helping them. It may be anecdotal. They may hear, from another legal state that this particular cultivar works for example, muscle spasms. So it's still, we're still finding out what really works and what really helps people and just what they like, what provides a pleasurable experience to the user. So there's a lot of experimenting and changing things, and even the market itself changes. So what was popular, like the recreational market is a good way to kind of look at things. What drives the recreational market kind of trends in different directions. So it may be like fruity, really fruit heavy strains are really popular for a period of time, and then it trends away to something else. Something like a real strong diesel gas type strain will be real popular in a rec market, and then it might trend over to something more earthy. Also, different consumers like different effects. So like in California, I know they're really driven, and different cities have different market demands. So like in areas that are like really tech heavy, like people like that really energizing, I can work all night sort of effect. But, in areas where maybe there's more manual labor type jobs, people might be looking for more of a sedative effect to help sleep or to manage pain. So like it's driven by the area and what type of work people do, and what type of medical issues they have. So it all kind of depends on where you're selling and what you're selling. And
so how do you pay attention to those trends and then decide to potentially try a new variety here?
So I think in a lot of situations we're just following the trends in other states. So like California, for example. California has kind of been obviously the leader on all things cannabis, and they have, decades of experience. So not only in cultivation and in production, but in how those markets function. So like I know I attend this conference. I attended it once, and it ended up getting canceled this year. I was really bummed out, but I'll definitely go again next year. It's in Michigan. It's up in Ann Arbor area, and it's called the Regenerative Cannabis Cultivation Conference. And like Dr. Elaine Ingham was a guest there. Kevin Jodrey, who I love, who is in a Humboldt grower that is really dialed in, like what the market is looking for and the market demands, as well as like cultivation techniques and all kinds of other good things. He was a guest speaker. A lot of living soil cannabis growers from the West Coast came, and also from the East Coast, where a lot of really exciting things are happening. Aquaponics cannabis growers were there, and you really could like tap into like the trends, like where is this going in California? I will say, like, generally other states seem to kind of be, like maybe a year or so behind what's happening in California. So you can kind of really monitor trends on the West Coast where, there's recreational markets that are mature, and take that information back to a less mature market like Ohio, or what is in demand in medical in one state that's more mature like California, then you'll see it trend toward Ohio. Michigan, though, is going to be a real leader, obviously, in cannabis, recreational and medical cannabis. They have been. And when I went to the Michigan Regenerative Conference, I was amazed at how the growers were already so organic oriented. In cannabis in general, organics has kind of come on later, so while there's a lot of home growers that are probably growing organically and maybe have, some organic farming experience or organic gardening experience and are taking that over to cannabis has still been, there's been a great prohibition against it. So it's been like a closet, kind of operation, which has led to having to eliminate a lot of the things that organic growers like to do. Like you couldn't maybe use soil indoors because it took up too much space or it created insect problems indoors. So people were more likely to use a hydroponic grow indoors just to eliminate, the risk of being caught or whatever. So it's kind of catching on a little later than other production models for agriculture, but it's it's advanced much more rapidly as well. So like Michigan, I mean, it was like a sold out conference and everyone there was like living soil experts. I mean, like these people were, regenerative, like hardcore, like making their own inputs, making their own fertilizers, building soil, making their own compost teas and all this kind of stuff was much more advanced than I had ever really thought cannabis was. But on the West Coast, I mean, that's the future. Like there's like the Dr. Bronner's Sun and Earth certification, is even taking like cannabis a step farther in the sense that it has to be grown in the sun. It has to be grown in soil in order to get this sticker so that the consumer knows when they're buying cannabis that this was grown in the sun, in the soil, so it's the regenerative practices are becoming a real important component of cannabis agriculture. And there's a premium that's paid for craft cannabis, just kind of like the craft brewing industry in a lot of ways. People are willing to pay more if that product is made with like whole food ingredients or made in this like really craft and sustainable method. That carries a premium in cannabis because of the sustainability component of it. But people are really now seeking out a living soil cannabis product because of its a superior product. Like they can taste fertilizers, they can taste synthetic nutrients, they can taste pesticides. It's if the product is grown in living soil, very clean environment, the true flavors and the true effects can come through so much more that there's connoisseurs of cannabis, East Coast and West, Midwest, everywhere, that will tell you that this is the best product on the market because all other things aside, sustainability aside, resource use, all those things, if you're not even factoring that in, it still tastes, smokes, consumes better than a product that's grown with synthetic nutrients or with pesticides or fungicides or whatever else, just like food. You know what I mean? Like you can taste an organic heirloom tomato from your backyard is going to taste better than the majority of, commercial tomatoes at the store. That kind of
So
same
going
concept.
back to the trends a little bit. So when will somebody come to you and say, we think this is going to be hot? Can you start working on getting something going, or is that your call?
I mean, I guess it's a little of both, So definitely patients will say, I wish this strain was available in the Ohio market. So, for example, like I'm trying to think of one that's specifically good. Like I know like LA Kush, we're not growing that, but I've had patients tell me like this works really well for muscle spasms. So there's a lot of people that have like uncontrollable muscle spasms that they are seeking out one particular cultivar. And because you can't, buy federal product, it has to be grown in Ohio, then they will approach a cultivator and say, can you please grow this? It helps me for this reason. And so we're always interested in hearing that from patients. I mean, that's like a really important part of how the market is driven. And plus, of course, if there's something out there that's helping people that we don't know about, we definitely would like to give that a try. But the majority of the trends are coming through just like social media, there's a lot of apps that track trends like Leafly and Weed Maps and these other apps that you can get to find out, like what strain works best for what. So people will like Google like what works best for anxiety or what works best for insomnia. And then they'll get a list of strains, and then, they can even like see where like Weed Maps does, well, that's grown at this cultivator and sold at this dispensary. So they can just like find on an app what they're looking for. But the trends generally just come, like again, like from West Coast growers generally, but the strains that are really popular quickly gain a big, a big pull where people are just demanding them as whole. Like right now, like it's like the cakes and the cookies, like the wedding cakes, the Girl Scout cookies. Girl Scout cookies was kind of like this.
Now you're talking cannabis strains, not the real cookies.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I'm talking cannabis strains. Yeah. So a lot of them have cakes and cookies names because they came from the original Girl Scout cookies cut. So like the burner cut, the breeder that grew the original Girl Scout cookies strain, then bred that with other cultivars to create new strains, like Do-si-dos, for an example, is the name of a strain that was created from a Girl Scout cookies lineage. Wedding cakes, we're growing Cake Crasher right now. Cake Crasher is like a wedding cake, wedding crasher cross. These cakes and cookie strains are really extremely popular right now. So there's a lot of lineages that came from original parentage that were like a Girl Scout cookies parentage that are extremely popular right now. So it's kind of, they gain like these like cult followings, like there's some breeders that just have like these crazy huge social media presences, and like literally breeders that have like these massive cult followings because they're so good at what they do of creating a cultivar that is like nothing no one's ever seen before, basically, so hybridizing plants, kind of like what's obviously been done with agriculture for years and years with potatoes and apples and everything else, tomatoes, like the heirloom tomato varieties. There's certain people like Mortgage Lifter. People are like, oh, you have to grow Mortgage Lifter. That's my favorite heirloom tomato variety. And so just like that, except sped up quite a bit more with cannabis, because it's all just like come online like in the past 20 years. So like the hybridizing has just been so rapidly sped up and condensed that it almost makes like this excitement, like what's going to be the next big cultivar that's going to come out of some of these big famous breeders,
So I'm not up to speed on cannabis at all. So I'm going to ask a really dumb question. Is Pineapple Express actually a strain?
Yes. Pineapple Express is actually a strain.
Really?
Yeah, there's a lot of pineapple strains, like Pineapple Skunk, and, like fruit terpene profiles carry over into a lot of the names. So there's like mangoes and pineapples and all kinds of delicious sounding names of cannabis that really do, like we're growing a strawberry heavy strain right now. We call it Organic Strawberry University. It comes from a strawberry haze parent, and it smells like strawberries, like it really does smell really fruity and good. And so a lot of people really look for those fruit flavors, fruit profiles. It just smells really good. It has different effects. And then when they're processed, a lot of that fruitiness carries into the processed good. So if it's processed into an oil or a vape cartridge or an edible, that fruit flavor really carries through to the finished product. So,
and I think you said it right, that in the cannabis industry, what I've just kind of watching from the outside, seeing what's happening, it's like you said, it's all of that different varieties is sped up compared to other industries. And I think quickly, and you said it too with the Regenerative Cannabis group in Michigan, all of that stuff, I mean, it was behind for so many years, but I think it's been done kind of underground for a long time. And now some of that knowledge is finally coming out in the open, and it's quickly speeding past all these other industries where, food, people are just realizing, organic is actually, you can actually taste more. Well, in the cannabis world, it seems that's starting to go on.
Yeah. And it is exciting too, because it's not, it can be a food product, but it's not just a food product. So all the benefits that you get from eating organic food, it's, there's things that are hard to even like measure or understand, but what medicinal effect that could be having on somebody when it's grown organically, we don't even know. I mean, there could be tremendous amounts of healing that maybe if the plant is organically grown can have on, like, say, like brain repair or something. You know, like, are we actually repairing tissue? I mean, is there the possibility of like healing and repairing tissue? There's not enough studies to show like, oh, that this could cure cancer, for example. You know, there's a lot of back and forth between the cannabis community and between the medical community where, you know, cannabis people will say, oh, it cured cancer. I mean, I have people that have come to me and said, I had a cancerous tumor and I used an oil on it every day and it went away. You know what I mean? Did it cure the cancer? Well, there's no scientific evidence to prove that it cured the cancer, but there's sure a lot of anecdotal evidence of it, of people healing cancerous lesions with using cannabis. So we don't know. Is it healing it? Is it not healing it? Is it placebo? Is it, you know, I mean, signs point to that it's healing it, but that's still not been studied enough to say we can use it to heal cancer. But
we run into that in the food world too, where, you know, we know that there's benefits from eating, you know, like you said, a Whole Foods diet versus a McDonald's diet.
Exactly.
And there's benefits there, but you can't say like organic in marketing. In the marketing world, you can't say that.
And it's even more of a fine line saying it with a drug, technically. You're not allowed to say, you know, that this, like herbal tea or whatever, you can't say that this stops your cough or whatever. It may stop your cough, but you can't put that on the label. So with cannabis, you know, the thought is, well, you know, as we find out more and more of these things, there's this whole new frontier of healing. Like for example, stopping someone's seizures. You know, that's been a really high profile thing. You've seen that with Charlotte's Web. You know, there's been a lot of children, adults who've had countless number of seizures day after day after day. I know parents of children who go through this, and they've used every seizure medication on the market, and it's done nothing to control their seizures, and then they go on to a cannabis oil and their seizures stop. Or maybe they have one a week or one a year, and they used to have 50 a day or something like that. So, I mean, we know it has very, you know, pronounced effects on certain medical conditions, and now it's gradually being turned into like a pharmaceutical drug in other countries, or, you know, here with Epidiolex and things like that. But it's still like this new frontier. And so like there's some very obvious and extreme examples of it in the ones I mentioned, but, you know, what type of healing could it be causing to people on a smaller level for just like an everyday sort of problem, like arthritis or something like that, you know? So I think that it feels really good, and it's exciting to know when you're doing it in an organic way that not only are you kind of like taking all the bad things out of it, like the pesticide residues and the you know, potential chemical residues from chemical nutrients, and you're doing all these things for like the planet and for sustainability, but also maybe you're making something that may be healing someone more so than the conventional version of that product, like with growing food. You know, like you just like, you know, like when I farmed produce, I didn't want to buy raspberries from the store when I could grow raspberries to give to my kids. It just was like, this feels like the right thing to do to raise the kids only eating these raspberries versus those. And then they develop a taste. Like, I don't like the way the raspberries taste from the store. They don't taste like raspberries, you know, and you're like, oh, okay. So it feels good to be growing organic cannabis and know that, you know, like when I do get patient feedback, like I have a patient that's been communicating with me that has a lot of medical problems that are very complex, and he has a lot of allergies. And, you know, he can communicate with me and be like, hey, I have, you know, allergies to all these different products. I use your product because I know that your fertilizers don't include any of those products, because maybe a little trace of that fertilizer could trigger one of my allergies and cause one of these problems. You know, so it's nice to know that he's like specifically seeking out our product because he can be assured that we're not using any of the fertilizers that may trigger some type of reaction in him. Or, and that's just fertilizers. Pesticides are where the real problems are, of course. And I've looked into the list of pesticides that are approved in Ohio, and I've never used any of those on food. They're like scary. And also, and that's for cannabis that's approved. And some of the other cultivators in Ohio that release what pesticides they use on their cannabis, I've researched those pesticides, these legal pesticides, and it's like unbelievable all the horrifying data there is that shows, like, one of our competitors was using a product that was listed as like a high level concern for causing like low birth weight in children, or causing potential endocrine disruption. And it's like, so you might, this is approved, but yet there's scientific data out there that shows that it disrupts your hormone production or something like that. Like, I couldn't market a product that I knew had that research attached to it that had this negative effect on people, and we don't even know what's happening when it's being combusted, so that's just if they're consuming it on food. Like, now what happens if they're smoking that? Does that mean that it's amplified? So it's kind of frightening.
Well, I thank you so much for being here.
Sure,
this was
absolutely.
eye-opening and extremely interesting. And I do want to mention Ohio Earth Food, because I know you use their
Absolutely.
product, and Rust Belt Riders, because they were both previous guests. And thanks to Nathan Rutz, he gave me your contact information, so that's why we're here today.
That's amazing.
So
yes, I love both of those companies. I've actually worked with Ohio Earth Foods for 15 years, so I've been buying Ohio Earth Foods soil amendments long before I got into cannabis. So it was really awesome to be able to bring those same products into a cannabis grow. I love Ted's products. I love Ohio Earth Food and what they've been doing for decades down in Hartville. And then Rust Belt Riders, I just can't say how good I feel growing in their soil, because it's like, it's really, if you have a good soil maker, that's a large part of being successful. Because with what we're doing, our soil has to be on point, and I know that the Rust Belt Riders are like really looking into our soil and producing like an amazing product for us. So it's been a great relationship to have with them. I love having the relationship we do with them. I'm glad you guys already had them on, because they're just like two jewels of Northeast Ohio here to me. It's amazing. Amazing part of the community.
well, thanks again so much for giving us the tour and for sitting down with us. I really
Absolutely.
enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.